So I was invited to give a presentation at the presidential session at the Society of American Archaeology at their virtual meeting on Thursday, April 15th, 2021. This session was called What is at Stake? The Impacts of Inequity and Harassment on the Practice of Archaeology. And it was organized by Amber Van der Walker, Maureen Myers, and Joe Watkins. So I'd like to start by thanking them for the invitation to be part of this session. It was a really wonderful session. I learned a lot from it. So I'm going to give you today a version of the paper that I presented there. So I would like to start by introducing myself. Once upon a time, I was an archaeologist and I worked first in the UK and later in the Andes. And at some point I did some historical archaeology projects in the US. But about 12 years ago, I became a sociocultural anthropologist who studies transnational collaborations between academics from the global north and the global south. And I used archaeologists as my main case study. Now in August this year, 2021, I stopped being an anthropologist of any kind because I'm currently switching careers to become a clinical mental health counselor who works specifically with academics. In a few years' time, once I'm qualified, I hope to be able to offer one-on-one therapy as well as department-based group workshops to students and researchers who have experienced trauma, depression, or other mental health challenges during fieldwork or at various stages in their academic careers. And as I go through this talk, it might become obvious why I see this as a natural extension of the work I've been doing with academics and anthropologists in particular over the last however many years. Okay. So today I want to talk about a paper that I wrote or I published in 2020 that analyzed why it is that women and those from working class backgrounds find it much harder to fit into academic communities like archaeology. I was using the case study of archaeology, but I see this as an example that can help us understand inequality in many other academic communities as well. This paper was called Myths of Meritocracy, Friendship, and Fun Work, and it described how subtle forms of inequality arise and thrive in archaeology because of the prevalence of what I call performative informality. Drawing on scholars of labor, education, and science, I drew attention in this paper to the problems inherent with conceptualizing a profession or a job as a family or as based in friendships. I showed how, when a profession like archaeology is understood to be fun and open, friendly and meritocratic, an individual's success depends on them inhabiting or enacting that professional community's specific version of informality correctly. Performing informality underpins whether people have a good feeling about you and thus whether doors open up for you. So today I'm going to very briefly describe what I mean by performative informality and how this relates to the topic of sexual harassment. And then I'm going to devote the rest of this time to drawing out the implications of how people reacted to that paper and thus the extent to which change is possible. My argument will focus on the uncomfortable fact that any change towards increased diversity and more meaningful inclusion and reparative justice has to involve some of us giving up something that we love. We can't get to the point where we have gender equity in academia, and thus we can't end sexual harassment without also addressing other forms of oppression. Of course, this is not a novel idea, and indeed many of the panelists in this session had made the similar point, that our feminism has to be intersectional, not only because that's the right thing to do, but also because if it isn't intersectional, it will be ineffective. What this means, however, is that all of us, including those of us who are white cisgendered feminists or who consider ourselves experts on feminist or post-colonial archaeology, may also have to give up some of our power or comfort in the interests of achieving our stated goals. So my contribution here is to suggest ways each of us can map out and consider some of the power and privileges we might otherwise be blind to. Not intentionally blind, but blind because those privileges are manifest as something as benign and personal as our friendships. So I came up with this term performative informality when I was trying to find a way to capture both the problems and joys of archaeology's very specific sociality. The heavy emphasis on alcohol, the kinds of rough and ready aesthetics of our dig clothes and our trucks, the humor and the in-jokes, the happy hours and the parties, but also the way that people talk about their colleagues as their second family, the friendships that stretch back over decades despite physical distance and crazy work schedules. Archaeologists talk about themselves as being fun, more fun than other disciplines, even sociocultural anthropologists. And then there is the drinking, at conferences, in the field, in departmental events, even in the classroom. The best ideas often come from these moments, when you're sitting in a bar somewhere during a conference like this one, having a wonderfully serendipitous conversation at 11 p.m. with someone you just met that afternoon on one side and the buddy you've known since grad school on the other side. Great research has come out of these moments. But these conversations are not as serendipitous or random as we like to think. Not everyone makes it to that bar at 11 p.m. In talking about performative informality, I'm attempting to draw attention to the unspoken class, gendered, and race dynamics of these informal spaces and moments, to point out that there are people who will feel uncomfortable or maybe even unsafe in these spaces. Why a female graduate student newly on the job market might feel uncomfortable meeting a senior male professor at a bar to talk about her work. Why an African-American male undergraduate might be cautious about joining a field school that has a reputation for wild parties and drinking if all the other students are white women. Now, the intense sociality of the field and the very real and significant friendships that people make are part of what makes archaeology special for many people. It's really important to recognize this, but we must also be honest about how the lack of boundaries between one's personal and professional life make it harder for everyone to advocate for their rights as employees or to push back against exploitation or discrimination. It's very hard to recognize somebody as your boss, let alone report them to HR if you also think of them as a friend. The lack of boundaries between work and play, between friend and colleague, are certainly likely to make it difficult for both victims and bystanders of sexual harassment. But it also allows other forms of inequality and discrimination to flourish as well. I received many positive responses to the Myths of Meritocracy paper, both from within anthropology and from other completely unrelated disciplines. People reached out over social media or emailed me to share deeply personal stories, or they shared the article on Twitter along with comments describing their own experiences. One common reaction was particularly interesting but also heartening. People who said that they felt relief and justification seeing their own experiences described in an academic journal as structural problems rather than their own personal failings. At the same time, and as I anticipated, the paper was criticized. There were those who told me about what they found problematic raised an issue that I actually have a lot of sympathy for. Namely that they themselves, despite being female and or working class, had found archaeology a welcoming place. Moreover, it was a place they could thrive precisely because of the informality and the friendliness that I had been highlighting. You might be thinking, I'm a woman. How can I be part of the problem of sexual harassment? Or, I was the first person in my family to go to college. How can you suggest that I'm holding other people back? The thing is, we all have multiple intersecting identities. We can be both victims and unconscious perpetrators of discrimination in different times and circumstances. So I want to invite you to do a short exercise. If you're listening to a recording of this session, I encourage you to pause the recording and do the exercise now after I've given you the instructions. Then come back and listen to the conclusion of this talk. So this exercise is based on the concept of the Invisible Knapsack Sac developed by women's studies scholar Peggy McIntosh in 1989. McIntosh noticed that while men may acknowledge that women are disadvantaged in society, they are reluctant or unable to acknowledge that they themselves are advantaged or privileged. Men will work to improve women's status, but will resist any attempt to diminish their own status. From here, McIntosh realized that she herself was similarly reluctant or unable to acknowledge her privileges as a white woman. My schooling, she wrote, gave me no training in seeing myself as an oppressor, as an unfairly advantaged person, or as a participant in a damaged culture. I was taught to see myself as an individual whose moral state depended on her individual moral will. So the goal of this exercise is to identify your multiple identities, because none of us are just one thing. And I've included here a tool from counseling called the respectful model, which can prompt you to think about this. So the first identity it talks about is your religious or spiritual identity. That can be something that is a major part of your identity or a part of your heritage. So for instance, I consider myself to be of a Christian heritage because that's my family background, even though I'm not actively a practicing Christian myself. Then your ethnic, cultural, or racial background, your sexual identity, your psychological maturity means your age, but it also takes into account that your chronological age doesn't always represent your psychological maturity, so the stage that you're actually at, particularly for people with learning disabilities, for instance. Then your economic or class background, your chronological or development challenges. Now that can be seen as your current stage in life. For instance, if you're an elder, if you're someone going through the menopause, if you're an adolescent, how you are treated and how you identify based on what stage of your life you're at, which also can be different from your chronological age, for instance. Then trauma and threats to one's personal well-being, the history and the legacy of carrying trauma in your body. It can be very important to your identity for some people. Your family history and dynamics, whether that's positive or negative. Unique physical characteristics and abilities. And again, this is very similar to the psychological maturity. It's talking about physical abilities and disabilities as opposed to mental or chronological differences in your age. And then your location of residence. And this can mean where you're currently living, but it can also mean your nationality, your citizenship. So if you have moved to the place you're currently working from another country, or if you're living in a particular part of the US, if you're in the US, what does that mean for you in your identity? Okay, so what I would like you to do is to write down for each of these categories, where are you? How do you see yourself? And how do other people see you? And then when you've written something down for each of those categories, think about which of these identities feel most important for you at this particular point in your life, right? Some of them may be things you've never even thought about, and others might be really significant parts of how you consider your identity. And then what I'd like you to do, either for those particular important ones, or if you have time for all of them, write down 3 or 4 privileges that that particular identity gives you in academia or in archaeology. Okay, and when you've done, come back. Okay. Right. I've highlighted here some of my responses to this exercise as an example to help you think through what you've written down for yourself. So what do we have here? I am a British and a US citizen. And what that means is that throughout my career, when I wanted to work or study in a foreign country, I can generally expect to get a visa. It might be a pain, but I don't anticipate really having any trouble being able to travel and work and study anywhere in the world if I want to. Equally, people have never questioned whether the universities where I got my degrees in the UK and the US are legitimate and actually real, right? As a white person, I can go to my university library or to my office or really just walk around anywhere on campus without worrying that someone's going to stop me and challenge my right to be there. I can be dressed in a hoodie, I can be dressed in jeans, I can be dressed as sloppy as I like, and I don't have to be concerned that people are going to assume that I don't belong somewhere on campus. As a native English speaker, I found that nearly all the books or journals I needed throughout my academic career, but particularly in college or in grad school, were very easily available in a language that I could read. Right? As a cisgendered heterosexual woman, I've never felt that I would be in danger if people at the field sites where I studied learnt of my sexual or gender identity. I've never had to hide that. I've never, for instance, had to create decoy social media accounts, like have duplicate social media accounts, so that people at my field site didn't learn about my gender or sexuality. I've never had to lie about my spouse's gender or even just think about it when I'm interacting with people. As a mother, and this is one that surprised me, I've never had to explain my reproductive choices to anybody, whether to colleagues or to informants in the field. And I was very surprised to discover that having a child, the particular age that I am, has been a very easy way to generate rapport with other parents in professional contexts. It becomes quite an acceptable topic of small talk at conferences or on campus. So the fact that I'm a mother gives me that ability to generate this kind of easy rapport with people. And lastly, my Christian heritage means that I've never been expected to teach or attend meetings on the holidays that I celebrate. I don't have to worry that the university, that I would have to make a specific request for the university to be closed at Christmas. I celebrate Christmas, and pretty much I can just assume that the university will be closed on that day, and I don't have to ask for a special accommodation. I've also never been asked to speak on behalf of all people in my religious background, especially not in a professional context. I've never gone to a workshop and had everyone turn to me and say, can you explain how Christians understand this particular concept? So now, as you can see from this and these different identities I've put here, despite being a woman and despite being somebody with insecure contingent employment within the academy, I still have a lot of power and privilege. It's really uncomfortable talking about this and talking about myself as somebody with privilege, particularly at a moment in time when I feel burnt out and taken for granted, generally powerless, and just generally screwed over by the dumpster fire of neoliberal capitalism and the insanity of 2020 and 2021. Now, summer 2020 was a very turbulent time to publish a paper like the one I wrote. The Black Lives Matter movement and the massive protests against police violence and the against anti-Black racism brought a rush of attention to previously marginalized issues in academia. The Black in the Ivory hashtag on Twitter shone a spotlight on the insidious but violent ways in which people of color, and Black people in particular, are marginalized in the academy in the US. Additionally, an investigation by the student newspaper at Harvard University brought to light very serious and disturbing allegations of sexual harassment leveled against several senior anthropologists, including the Andean archaeologist Gary Urton. Now, there was something important about the convergence of these two issues and the reaction to them. Protesters were in the street insisting that police violence is not a bad apple problem, but rather endemic to US society and based in structural violence. Watching the fallout from the Gary Urton case in particular, however, I was concerned that when it comes to thinking about sexual harassment within archaeology, we are still limiting ourselves to finding, shaming, and punishing individual predators. We are still looking at just the bad apples. We know that racism has not persisted for so long because a handful of bad white people intentionally discriminate against people of color. Similarly, then, we should know that gender-based discrimination and harassment are not endemic in archaeology just because a few horny men can't control their lust. Rather, both these and other forms of discrimination have their roots in the power relations that structure and organize academia, and the structural violence of the wider society that archaeology is embedded within. Treating each sexual harassment scandal as an isolated problem of a few gross, creepy men distracts from the real problem, which is that power in academia and US society at large is both unevenly distributed and routinely disguised as benign or outright denied. Now, the historian of science, Sharon Turek, wrote when she was describing the culture of physics in the US in comparison to Japan, that the style is informal, but the group structure is hierarchical. Informality is a gift or reward bestowed by those in charge. To which I add that informality is a style that is so ingrained in the US that those in charge may not even recognize they are bestowing it selectively. Certain people have a lot of power, but even they may not realize it because that power is partly wielded through what appears to be its opposite, informality. Thus, it is a power that is constantly denied by its own enactment. And this is so pervasive, so ingrained, and draws so directly from core US cultural value systems, such as meritocracy, that it becomes impossible to see, let alone to critique, even when you're up to your neck in it. Now, luckily, much of the conceptual work around this topic has already been done, notably by Indigenous and Black scholars in archaeology and beyond. So now we just have to have the courage to draw on the extensive existing scholarship on oppression and discrimination and choose to recognize that none of us are not culpable. The problems are intersectional and so are the solutions. But for the discipline to change, we all have to be accomplices in the fight for equality. And that may mean risking some of our own status and privilege. Right now, archaeology in the US is disproportionately white. In terms of the upper echelons of the discipline, the people with the most resources and epistemic influence, it is also disproportionately male. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want to change this? Do you want an archaeology that has a proportionate number of people of color and women at all levels, but especially in senior positions that come with power and influence? Do you want your discipline to be more equitable if it means your grant applications are no longer as competitive, if your students don't get jobs, if when you go to a conference, you no longer run into friends in the corridors, or you can't automatically work anywhere in the world that you want to anymore? We can't just parachute underrepresented people into positions of power and then expect them to assimilate into the discipline as it currently stands. This is not just a matter of making more diverse hires and expecting them to sink or swim. Many of my fellow panelists in this session have documented extensively how a tokenistic approach does not work. Over the last decades, more women entered archaeology as undergraduates and even as graduate students, but the profession has remained organized around the academic interests and domestic obligations of white middle-class men with accommodating stay-at-home wives. Unable to fit themselves into this structure, into the system that was not built for them, many women just leave. Now, I think about this whenever I see well-meaning calls for change in archaeology or in other academic disciplines that appear only to be able to imagine solutions that are aimed at students or the general public, not the people who are currently in power, i.e. current faculty. Students are not, and the public are not the ones who hold all the epistemic, economic, and socio-political power in archaeology. Limiting our focus to changing how we educate students, for instance, by decolonizing syllabi, is tantamount to saying that the problem just has to wait. The time isn't right yet, but hopefully the next generation will solve it if we start decolonizing our syllabi now and teaching them differently. If we are committed to making change now, our focus must be on educating existing faculty, not students. The people who sit on hiring committees are the ones who should be updating their knowledge of critical race theory or post-colonial theory or queer theory or radical feminism and indigenous epistemologies. The people who are currently peer reviewing grant applications or serving as editors for journals and organizing conferences, these are the people we should be concerned about, the people who have power now, not in a hypothetical better future. It's hard to accept that the things we love and value about archaeology, the fun and camaraderie, may unintentionally be part of the problem. But if we want a more just and meritocratic academic community, that community has to radically change, not only in terms of the kinds of decisions that are made on what to publish and what research to fund, but also in terms of how we behave and treat each other in our departments, at faculty meetings, in the field, and at conferences. The long-term benefits of giving up some of the things we love, however, will be shared by everyone. Not only would archaeology be a more dynamic and vibrant academic community, but ultimately we would all benefit from putting in place and then respecting the boundaries between our personal and professional lives, from recognizing that archaeology and academia in general is a job and not a lifestyle.